The bill has received a lot of criticism, though, from First Nations communities over its lack of consultation. And joining me right now to speak more about this is the Assembly of First Nations National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak. Thank you so much for joining us, National Chief.
Thank you for welcoming us to your show.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, you're one of many First Nation leaders that is asking Governor General Mary Simon to intervene in this using her powers. What exactly do you want her to do?
Look, I'm not going to comment on that any further, but I am just going to say that I think Parliament can do the right thing and the Senate can do the right thing. Next week, we will be talking to senators. We've been talking to them all day. We'll continue to talk to them throughout the weekend and throughout next week on, making sure that First Nations rights holders, have a chance to speak on Bill C-5 during the legislative process. So far, they have been shut out. The Assembly of First Nations remains very concerned about the lack of time and the refusal to accommodate First Nations rights holders wishing to have direct input into the legislative process that is advancing Bill C-5 on the One Canadian Economy Act very quickly. We have witnessed the unacceptable exclusion of many chiefs this past week as they were turned away and specifically uninvited from participation in the Parliamentary Committee of the House of Commons and the Senate of Canada. And it is 2025. And I think for any Canadian, First Nations included, it's not acceptable to keep First Nations rights holders out of discussions about their rights as they are being legislated on. This should not be the Canadian way.
National Chief, I know you said that you don't want to comment any further on asking Mary Simon to intervene. I just want to be clear, though, is that still your wish, that you want her to intervene on this?
Look, I think right now I want senators and members of Parliament to do the right thing. I think that they need to make sure that, that they're doing everything that they can to make sure that they're hearing Canadians, First Nations included, and following their own processes and bills rather than ramming through a bill that could really much affect our children and grandchildren and other governments down the road. That we want to make sure that things are done properly and carefully and that First Nations are consulted, and we haven't been. And it's disheartening when I went to speak for 5 minutes both times, 5 minutes in the House, to have so many leadership from coast to coast to coast sitting with me that weren't able to speak for themselves. And I think that has to change. We can do better as a country.
Now, the Prime Minister has said, as he's been presenting this bill and as he's been talking about it, that Indigenous communities will be consulted along the way. Do you not believe him?
It's not that, I don't want to talk about belief or not, but, we don't want to go into hypothetical situations. We always want to make sure that, when you're doing bills like this, that they're in black and white, that people are consulted properly, that our lawyers, our First Nations experts, our First Nations experts in law, our First Nations experts on our treaty rights, that they have a chance to thoroughly review. And I don't think 7 days is enough time. We need a little bit more time. We need time to review this properly. We need time for chiefs and leadership across the country to gather so that they can speak about this and how this is going to affect us for the years to come. And I don't think that that's a whole lot to ask. Look, the Parliament wanting to ram this through, take the summer, take the time to speak to First Nations.
I wanted to ask you specifically about one of the amendments that was made on Wednesday, and it did take away Cabinet's ability to sidestep the Indian Act, but you had called that a limited change. Why do you think that's limited?
Well, I think, just some of the amendments that have been made to Bill C-5, it is encouraging that the Part 2 Purpose Clause implies, and statements by the Prime Minister and other Minister of the Crown explicitly promise that free, prior, and informed consent standard will be applied to every proposed project or national interest project to be, quote, pre-approved by this legislation. That pre-approval, however, in itself contrary to the free, prior, and informed consent standard and jurisprudence on the duty to consult, accommodate, and obtain consent. So it is not at all clear why Part 2 does not include an operative provision requiring what the Purpose Clause and ministers have repeatedly promised: free, prior, and informed consent from First Nations affected by any given project that is approved under the extraordinary powers conferred on Cabinet, Ministers of the Crown by Parliament. The AFN calls on senators to address this deficiency. And so this weekend, Canadians will be marking National Indigenous Peoples Day and a 4-year anniversary of the passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The advocacy of First Nations and solidarity with each other will continue in our collective work to protect our rights as nations and as people. So we are peoples and nations under international law, and inherent authority and jurisdiction on our reserve lands and traditional territory. So we do need time to speak to our experts to see what their recommendations are. And I know many First Nations are wanting to submit written submissions. 34 of them are still fighting firefighters. What about those 34 communities right across the country that haven't had time to review this and to give us their opinion on what should be changed, what should be included, and if it's a good enough bill or not? And we need that time to speak with each other. And it's a two-way street with government. I think the Prime Minister and the ministers themselves need to be out there speaking to the country, First Nations included, as well as Canadians and environmental groups.
Nobody wants to sort of prejudge what may happen, but there have been threats in the last couple of weeks from different Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership that if this bill goes forward and does become law, that we could be seeing what some have called an Idle No More 2.0 with disruptions in different trade corridors and that type of thing. What can you say to Canadians about what we will hear from Indigenous voices going forward if this legislation also goes forward this summer?
Look, I think First Nations want to be, they don't want to stop prosperity. They want to be a part of prosperity. They've been wanting that since the beginning of time. I mean, we signed treaties that we would share equally in the resources of this country. And, we just want our own share in this country. We don't want anyone's, and I just think that we also don't want our rights trampled on. And trust is a big thing. I think relationships need to be built. I know we've been building. I thought that we were coming a long way, and I think that we are. But at the same time, when ramming a bill like this through that affects our rights, and some people haven't had time to digest it, maybe they haven't had time to review it properly within their own communities and with their own lawyers and legal experts, it's tough to, and we haven't had time to meet as a collective. So we do want to meet as a collective this summer, and we're just asking for the time to do that properly.
Okay. National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Cindy Woodhouse, Nepinak, I appreciate you coming on such short notice and giving us the time today and giving us your perspective as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.